Hi, everyone. This is the Unravelling 1970s Lecture 1. Your book calls this the Unravelling, and so I wanted to stick with that. I don't particularly like the term unraveling because it's a little deterministic. It sort of gives the impression that the raveling or the what we might call the New Deal consensus that lasted from the mid 40s to the mid 70s was inevitable, or that it was the best thing. Well, depending on someone's politics, they might think it was a good thing, but they might think it wasn't a good thing, or might think it was the right thing for the country to do, or might think it's not the right thing for the country to do anyway. So I generally don't like these deterministic words that sort of explain everything. But it did seem, certainly in the 1970s, maybe even starting in 1978 and 1968, that things were starting to unravel, or at least there was a perception that things were starting to unravel. So maybe that's what your book authors are talking about when they say that. And certainly by the time of the 1980, both the 76, the 72 presidential election, and then even the 1980 presidential election, there was a lot of talk of society is falling apart and it needs to be fixed. These two images you see here are two of the three biggest issues I think that happened during the 70s. One is Nixon and the Watergate crisis, and the other is an advertisement for the tennis battle of the sexes, Bobby Riggs versus Billie Jean King, which was in 1973, and I distinctly remember seeing it. And I put it up there because it was a part of the sort of cultural debate and stuff on what was then called women's lib and women's equality. So I think these are two very good images to capture the first half of the 1970s. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about, of course, about Nixon, Vietnam, and Watergate, the end of the golden age. Some other historians call it the golden age, which again is this sort of consensus about New Deal values, the rising tide of conservatism, and of course end with the Reagan Revolution of the late 70s, and the election of 1980. I think obviously Nixon had been a politician, a major politician since 1947, so it's important to study him. And once he becomes president, he's been through the ringer several times in the political flow of the country's history. So I think it's very interesting to ask what were the major policies of the Nixon administration on social and economic issues, because I'm certain they were very different than they would have been if he had won the 1960 election. In the post-World War II era, you see conservatism, Nixon's kind of conservatism, seemed marginal in a very liberal or progressive environment, or a very New Deal environment. Conservatism was seen as outdated and associated with conspiracy theories and anti-Semitism and preferences for social hierarchy over equality. Liberals believed that conservatives were simply alienated or psychologically disturbed. But in the 50s and 60s, conservatism was also reborn. In 1968, a backlash of formerly Democratic voters against black protest and the anti-war movement helped Richard Nixon win the White House. But conservatives were also dissatisfied with Nixon. He had adopted conservative language, but he actually expanded the welfare state and improved relations with the communist countries of the Soviet Union and China, and they felt Nixon was a sellout. He had been a hardcore right-wing man, or certainly a hardcore anti-communist for most of his life, but then when it came to govern, he changed. They thought he changed. Nixon won by a thin margin, right? Popular vote-wise. Moved to the center, trying to solidify Republican support and win over disaffected Democrats. Okay. He was mostly interested in foreign policy and wanted to avoid fights with the Democratic Congress over domestic policy. So he actually accepted and expanded much of the Great Society and welfare state. Nixon established new federal regulatory agencies, such as the Environmental Protection Agency, OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, and the National Transportation Safety Board, all of which limited entrepreneurial sort of freedom of action. Nixon spent very liberally on social services and environmental initiatives. He abolished the Office of Economic Opportunity, which had coordinated the war on poverty, but he also expanded food stamps and tied Social Security benefits to inflation. The Endangered Species and Clean Air Acts regulated business in order to limit pollution and protect animals threatened with extinction. Nixon's great surprise for the country was his proposal for a family assistance plan to replace aid to families with dependent children. Under his plan, the federal government would guarantee a minimum income for all Americans. Now, the aid to families with dependent children, known as welfare, gave aid, usually very limited, to poor families who met local eligibility requirements. It was originally a New Deal program that helped mostly the white poor. But welfare, the word welfare, came to be associated with blacks, who by 1970 comprised half of all welfare recipients. The AFDC roles expanded in the 1960s, partly because of relaxed federal eligibility standards, and these relaxed standards stemmed from an increase in births to unmarried women, which produced a sharp rise in the number of poor female-headed households. Conservative politicians now attacked welfare recipients as people who want to live off honest taxpayers rather than work. But Nixon's plan for a guaranteed income, which was too radical enough for conservatives and not enough for liberals, didn't pass Congress. Nixon's racial policy was ambiguous. He nominated conservative Southern jurists for the Supreme Court. These jurists favored segregation, and he did this in order to try to win over the white South, but the Senate rejected them. Okay, the courts lost patience with Southern delays in enforcing civil rights laws and finally forced Southern schools to desegregate. Briefly, Nixon also embraced affirmative action programs to raise minority employment. Nixon also expanded Johnson's efforts to require federal contractors to hire minorities, but Nixon wanted the affirmative action program as a way to fight inflation by weakening the power of building trade unions. He believed their control over the labor market, hiked wages to unreasonable levels and increased construction costs. He hoped the plan would cause tension between blacks and labor unions, and then the Republicans would benefit. Again, Republicans benefiting from labor union members going over to their party, and then this is exactly what happened. Trade unions of skilled construction workers with few black members strongly opposed Nixon's plan. Nixon hoped to win over blue-collar voters in the 1972 election, and he quickly replaced his affirmative action plan with a program that did not require federal contractors to hire minorities. Now, here is an interesting map. This is a center of population map from the beginning of the country till, 2010, more or less now. And this shows roughly east to west where the geographic center of American population was. And you can see that in colonial times it was in Delaware, very close to Philadelphia, meaning that half of the people in the country lived on the eastern side of Philadelphia and the other half lived on the western side. Well, that, as the West expands and grows, that moves very gradually westward, so that in effect by the 21st century, it's in Missouri, which is obviously in the middle of the country. This map does take into account, by the way, Native American populations, so it's not restricted in that regard. It is accurate in that regard. This is a picture of Nixon and Jim Brown. Okay, Nixon, he pursued the Southern strategy to try to get Southern whites to support him, but he also tried to court black support. And here he meets with 3 African Americans in the White House, including football legend and actor Jim Brown, who's the one on Nixon's left there, dressed all in white. He was many people consider him the best football player who ever lived. He retired from football rather early to take up a kind of acting career that turned out to be pretty lame. But anyway, he was certainly one of the biggest people in the 1960s and 1970s, one of the most well-known. And here's Nixon and Wallace. Nixon on the right and former Alabama Governor George Wallace at an Honor America celebration in 1974. Nixon's Southern strategy sought to woo Wallace's supporters into the Republican Party. Now, remember, Wallace is the guy who said in the early 60s, stood in the courthouse door and said, segregation now, we would not let people in. He's the guy who said segregation now, segregation forever at a rally against civil rights in Alabama. So, the fact that Nixon is willing to have somebody like that sit with him is an amazing thing. Okay. Now, it's also time to return to looking at the Supreme Court. Okay, Supreme Court obviously is the third branch of government. It's a co-equal branch of government. It's often forgotten about in the sort of popular histories. But it's very, very important. And when Earl Warren retired as Chief Justice in 1969, Nixon replaced him with Warren Burger, who had been an opponent of the Warren Court's judicial activism. Burger was expected to lead the court in a conservative direction, but he surprised Nixon and others by initially expanding much of the Warren Court's jurisprudence. As I've said before, you can never tell what judges are going to do when they get on the court, and presidents, especially when they nominate certain people for ideological reasons, are almost universally disappointed in what the justices do when they get on the court. Well, one of the reasons for that is when you get on the Supreme Court, you are the top legal dog in the country. You don't have to think about re-election. You don't have to think about your appeal to anybody. It's a lifetime appointment. You can actually sit back and think about what you think is right and what you think is constitutional. Okay. In 1971, the court approved plans to integrate Southern schools through busing, in which students were transported to other schools to make an integrated student body. So judges everywhere began to order busing, and this angered many white parents who wanted to keep their children in the majority white neighborhood schools. So there were particularly bitter and violent protests in lots of cities. Boston was very, very vicious. In only a few years, the court reversed itself and abandoned efforts to wrest control of local schools or to bus students great distances to achieve integration. Okay. Rulings absolved suburban districts of the responsibility of enrolling non-white students and often poor students from non-suburban neighborhoods. And in 1973, the court ruled in a case out of Texas that public schools did not have to be equally funded, creating a de facto disparity in school funding based on class and race. And by the 1990s, northern public schools were more segregated than southern schools. Efforts to gain more job opportunities for minorities also sparked bitter legal battles and white resentments. Many whites came to see affirmative action programs as reverse discrimination that violated the 14th Amendment by giving non-whites special advantages over whites. As affirmative action spread from blacks to include women, Latinos, Asian, and Native Americans, conservatives demand that the Supreme Court ban such programs. The Supreme Court refused, but offered no consistent real position. Okay, but the court proved more and more hostile overall to government affirmative action programs. In 1978, the court shot down a University of California admissions program that set aside a quota of places for non-white medical students. The majority rejected the ideas of quotas while ruling that race could be one factor among many in college admissions. Okay, this was the 1978 Regents of the University of California versus Bakke case, and is still the standard by which affirmative action programs are judged today. Okay, now let's look at Nixon and foreign policy. Conservatives also believed that Nixon had gone soft on foreign policy. Certainly, Nixon and Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, continued their predecessors' policies of trying to undermine governments that seemed to endanger U.S. strategic or economic interests. Nixon sent arms to pro-American dictators in Iran, in the Philippines, South Africa, and when Chileans elected the socialist Salvador Allende as president, the Central Intelligence Agency helped his domestic opponents launch a coup against him in September 1973 that overthrew and killed Allende and installed a bloody regime ruled by General Augusto Pinochet. Thousands of Allende supporters, including some Americans, were tortured and murdered while others fled the country. In relations with major communist countries, however, Nixon altered Cold War tensions. He had launched his career, remember, as I keep saying, as a militant anti-communist, but he and Kissinger, and especially Kissinger, were realists. They were more interested in power than ideology and preferred stability to endless conflict. And what I mean by that, they're more interested in the power of relations and making them work, not necessarily in gaining more power themselves. Nixon hoped that better relations with the Soviet Union would pressure North Vietnam to end the Vietnam War on acceptable terms to Americans. He also realized that China had its own interests separate from those of the Soviets and would soon be a major power. So in early 1972, he made a highly publicized trip to Beijing, which led to China's finally occupying its seat in the United Nations. Now, although full diplomatic relations with China were not established until 1979, Nixon's visit sparked a vast trade increase between the U.S. and China. 3 months after that trip, Nixon became the first president to visit the Soviet Union, where he negotiated with the Soviet Premier Leonid Brezhnev. The talks led to increased trade and two landmark arms control treaties. One was SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which capped each country's arsenals of intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, right, which banned the development of systems for intercepting incoming missiles. Nixon and Brezhnev declared a new age of peaceful coexistence in which détente, cooperation, would replace Cold War hostilities. This is Nixon at a banquet in China in February 1972. At his right is Zhou Enlai, the premier of China. Okay. But all of this, of course, becomes... So you have these kind of two different sides of the Nixon foreign policy. The thaw in relations with the major communist powers, but the real crackdown in extremists with regard to other non-aligned countries in the world, like Chile. Now, as I keep saying, Watergate is one of the biggest issues of the 70s, and Vietnam is still going on. So I think an important focus question for this period of the lecture would be, how did Vietnam and Watergate affect popular trust in the government? Okay, the first thing to work on is the Vietnamization of the Vietnam War. Remember, he had planned in 1968 that he had a secret plan to end the Vietnam War. So once in office, he declared this new policy, which is Vietnamization. Terrible word, lame word to pronounce, but it's a policy where U.S. troops would be gradually withdrawn while South Vietnamese troops, backed by U.S. bombing, would take up combat. But Vietnamization did not limit the war or end the anti-war movement. In early 1970, Nixon ordered U.S. troops into neutral Cambodia in order to disrupt supply lines to the south. Not to the south, meaning I should say that moving to the south, meaning moving to North Vietnamese. But the invasion did not achieve its military goals, and it destabilized the Cambodian government. This started a chain of events that brought to power the Khmer Rouge, who forced most Cambodians to migrate into the countryside and massacred millions. It also sparked the largest protests in U.S. history, the largest student protests anyway in U.S. history. In a demonstration at Kent State University, the Ohio National Guard killed 4 anti-war protesters. At Jackson State in Mississippi, 2 students were killed by police. More than 350 colleges and universities had student strikes, and 21 campuses were occupied by troops. At the same time, troop morale also dropped. Although all young men were subject to the draft, most college students received deferments. The Army was mostly composed of working-class whites and poor racial minorities. African Americans complained of having disproportionately higher casualty rates than white soldiers, and the military was not immune from domestic social and cultural changes. More and more soldiers wore peace and black power symbols. They used drugs, they refused orders, they deserted, and they assaulted and even killed unpopular officers. The erosion in discipline convinced many high-ranking officers that the United States had to pull out of Vietnam. Now, at the same time, public support for the war declined. Revelations in 1969 that the U.S. had committed a massacre of some 350 civilians at My Lai the year before shocked the nation. In 1971, the New York Times published the Pentagon Papers, a classified government report that traced U.S. involvement in Vietnam back to World War II and showed how more than one president had misled the American public about it. Okay. The Supreme Court rejected Nixon's efforts to suppress the Pentagon Papers publication. And in 1973, Congress passed the War Powers Act, which limited presidential authority by requiring congressional approval for troops in order to commit troops overseas. You remember that in Vietnam, the war was never declared. Congress has to declare war. Congress has the sole power to declare war. But the executive branch, under various authorities, can send troops, and so that was limited in 73 with the War Powers Act. In 1973, also, Nixon sealed the Paris Peace Agreements and started to withdraw U.S. troops. The compromise left South Vietnam's government intact, but it also left North Vietnamese and Viet Cong troops in control of parts of the South. U.S. bombing stopped and the draft ceased, but the North Vietnamese launched a final offensive in 1975 that toppled South Vietnam's government. The U.S. evacuated its embassy, and Vietnam was reunified under communist rule. Overall, the Vietnam War was a military, political, and social disaster in which 58,000 Americans were killed, along with 3 to 4 million Vietnamese. The war cost the United States $100 billion, but the higher cost was to Americans' confidence in their own institution and their nation's ideals and purposes. Some took the lesson that the United States should be extremely reluctant to send troops overseas, which was sometimes called the Vietnam Syndrome. And policymakers behind the war, such as former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, have since said the war was a terrible mistake. Ignorance of the history and conflict of Vietnam, history and culture of Vietnam, and a misguided belief that every communist movement in the war was a Soviet puppet, every communist movement, every communist group was a Soviet puppet, were significant mistakes, according to McNamara. Now, this didn't go down very well. The New York Times and many others rejected McNamara's apology and maintained that the United States had the right to decide the fate of a faraway people about whom it knew almost nothing. We had maintained the criticism of the right to that debate, to that policy. This is a picture of Kent State University. This is tear gas envelops the students. Members of the Ohio National Guard prepared a fire on student demonstrators, and they did so, and 4 students died, as you may probably already know. This is Jackson State. It's a historically black college and university in Mississippi. Students peer from a residence hall window, which was pockmarked by bullet holes. 2 students were killed when police opened fire on the building, claiming they were returning sniper fire, but of course there had been no sniper fire. The event took place 11 days after Kent State, but received far less attention. I generally don't like things like, the unraveling or the golden age, things like that. But, lots of people did think of this period that Watergate ended a kind of golden age. It ended a kind of age of minimal trust in government. But what it also ended was or it also diminished the opportunities of most Americans in the 1970s. And really the best way to look at it, this aspect of the 1970s is growing economic woes. The 1970s prosperity, in the 1970s, post-war economic expansion and consumer prosperity ended, followed by slow growth and high inflation. And this is where people call it's the end of capitalism's golden age, but it was caused by many factors. The booming economy, in part driven by military spending. But with that, administrations hadn't realized how the Cold War might have less positive economic consequences. To check the Soviets, the U.S. had promoted the economic reconstruction of Japan and Germany and supported new manufacturing in places like South Korea and Taiwan. It encouraged American companies to invest overseas and didn't complain when allies protected their own industries while seeking unrestricted access to U.S. markets. Steel imports, for example, devastated the American steel industry. And the strong dollar tied to gold by the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement made it harder to sell goods overseas. For 1971, for the first time in the 20th century, the U.S. had a trade deficit, importing more goods than it exported. By 1980, almost all goods produced in the United States were competing with foreign-made products, and the number of manufacturing workers had declined to 28%. It had been almost 40% in 1960. The Vietnam War also produced higher federal deficits and rising inflation. In 1971, Nixon announced a radical departure in economic policy. He took the United States off the gold standard, ending the Bretton Woods Agreement that fixed the value of the dollar and currencies in gold. From now on, world currencies floated in relation to one another, so their worth was determined not by treaty but by international currency markets. Nixon hoped that this would promote U.S. exports, but the end of fixed currency rates ended up destabilizing the world economy. Nixon also froze wages and prices in 1971 for 90 days in order to stabilize the economy. These policies briefly stopped inflation and reduced imports, but a war between Israel and its neighbors Egypt and Syria led Middle Eastern governments to hike the price of oil and suspend oil imports to the United States for several months. During the oil embargo, long lines of cars appeared at American gas stations, which either ran out of fuel or limited how much a customer could buy. By this point, the U.S. imported 1/3 of its oil. Congress lowered the speed limit and urged conservation to save fuel. This was an enormously unpopular measure, lowering the speed limit anyway. The energy crisis focused public attention on domestic energy sources like oil, coal, and natural gas. Oil exploration increased in the American West, and in Alaska, pipelines opened to facilitate the shipment to the rest of the country. Coal production in Wyoming boomed, and the oil prices set by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, benefited Western energy companies. But rising oil prices affected the global economy and contributed to the combination of stagnant economic growth and high inflation, which came to be known as stagflation. Between 1973 and 1981, the inflation index in developed countries was 10% per year, while economic growth was 2.4% per year, a sharp deterioration from the 1960s, right? The so-called misery index, the sum of unemployment and inflation rates, stood at 10.8 in 1970. By 1980, it was 22. It was almost 22. And with higher oil prices, Americans bought more fuel-efficient cars, which hurt the domestic auto industry. Fuel-efficient cars came from Japan and Germany for a large part, and that hurt the traditional American auto prices. This is a picture of drivers lining up to purchase gas in San Jose, California, during the gas shortage of early 1974, and you see that this is how bad it got. One man is standing in line with his lawnmower, hoping to fill up his lawnmower. That's how scarce it got. Here's the misery index, 1970 to 1980, and you can see it going up. Year 1970, 10.8. Year 1980, 20.6. So that's really quite dramatic. Here is the construction of the World Trade Center. I thought this was an interesting thing to put in a lecture about the 1970s because it was an extremely interesting thing. It was not only became the tallest building in the country, I think maybe briefly the tallest building in the world, soon surpassed by the Sears Tower in Chicago. But anyway, it was a massive, massive construction effort in the 1970s. It was really quite an impressive technological feat and engineering feat. This is one of the towers. This is one of the towers being almost completed, and you can see the other tower sort of starting below. And it really is amazing to think that the World Trade Center only, and I'm putting only in quotation marks, lasted 30 years. And here finally is real average weekly wages 1955 to 1990. And you can see they sort of peak at the end of the 60s, and then they decline all the way to the 1990s. And that's what I think really tends to make many analysts consider this period, to quote, the unraveling. So we'll talk more about that in the next lecture.